What's going on? It's Fuego here, and today the work in progress balance changes for January 2025 just dropped, so I'm going to be giving my thoughts on them. And the first one here, we have the Archer Queen with the ability cooldown going from 15 seconds to 17 seconds. And now this is definitely going to be a noticeable nerf. I feel like this is going to come in play. You remember whenever you get those last second Archer Queen abilities, like you use your ability on defense, it goes down, travels to your opponent's side, and then you get that last second ability. Yeah, that's not going to happen anymore. 17 seconds is a long time. It's going to be much harder getting to that second ability, but Archer Queen is still going to be strong. And as you guys will see later, there's going to be a Goblenstien nerf, so Archer Queen could definitely see some more use. So it's just going to be harder to get that game-winning value that you get when you get two abilities. Next up is the Ram Rider that's receiving a health points nerf. It's going from 1767 to 1696. And you know what? Ram Rider has been pretty strong. It's definitely benefited from how good the Pekka and the Goblenstien have been recently. And don't forget that it actually got buffed in February when its charge range actually got reduced to 2 tiles from 3. So Ram Rider is definitely good. I believe that it does deserve this nerf. It's not too crazy, only minus 4%, but it's definitely going to be noticeable. And those last second charges that the Ram Rider gets on your tower will be no more. And it's just going to be easier to take out in general. But yeah, still going to be a good card overall. Definitely going to see it a little bit less than what we do in this current meta. The next change is super important. The Evo Pekka is getting a rework to where it heals different amounts based off the type of troop it kills. So it actually gets separated into 3 types of troops that it can kill. You have small, medium, and large. So obviously it's going to heal more from killing large troops, almost double what it normally heals right now, and it heals about half of what it gets from killing small troops. So this is definitely going to come into play when taking out swarms, I would say. Evo Pekka has been strong against swarms just based off how much it heals even whenever it kills a skeleton, but now that's no longer the case. It only heals 142 when killing a troop of that size, and that's going to make swarms better against Pekka, which honestly I feel like having an Evo Pekka that can counter swarms pretty easily is kind of broken, and I mean we definitely saw that in the meta. But honestly, it's going to be a lot better against tanks. Like, if it kills a Megaknight in, like, 3 or 4 swings, it's going to heal 500 health. Like, that's no joke right there. So that's definitely has different uses than it did before, but I still think it's going to be good. Definitely weaker, but yeah, definitely still a good Evo. Evo Skellies are getting a nerf in their unit count, going down from 4 skeletons to 3, and I think this one could be a lot more impactful than people might expect. I feel like a lot of the times, honestly in more cases than not, I feel like my Evo Skelly, 3 of them die, but 1 of them gets that hit, and that's just enough for them to spawn, especially against recruits in cards that are able to take out the skeletons fast. And the most important thing about Evo Skellies is that they either work or they don't for the most part. Like, if they spawn, they normally take out the troop that you're trying to kill, and they just stall for a while. But if they die in that first attack from the units, while they take a second before they can start swinging, and they just die, then you really don't get much value from this evolution at all. I feel like skeletons honestly could come back into the meta more than Evo Skeletons, and probably going to see a decrease in that. Cycle deck's probably still going to run them just because there's no point forcing in other random Evos. But yeah, Evo Skellies is definitely going to take a hit. We got a buff for the Goblin Demolisher, and I think this is actually pretty good. Goblin Demolisher is definitely a card that I think is worthy of a buff. It's getting a lifetime increase from 7 seconds to 8 seconds, and I feel like this is a good place to buff the Goblin Demolisher, because a lot of times once the Goblin Demolisher hits its health state, they can fireball it on your side of the map, and it just doesn't get anywhere. And I know that won't change with this buff, but I feel like it's a step in the right direction, because the Goblin Demolisher just seemed to die so quickly beforehand, never really had a chance of making it to your opponent's tower anymore, but this could definitely help get it back on the right track. Evo Cannon's barrage damage is getting buffed from 320 to 353, and I feel like this can be pretty impactful as well, because if you think about it, the Evo Cannon has a chance of hitting a lot of troops. And granted, most of the shots end up hitting nothing and just looking cool on the map, but a lot of the shots can get some decent value, especially against swarm decks and decks that have to stack up units for big pushes. So this increase could honestly represent more than the 33 damage it actually is. I mean, if you get 3 shots, then that's already up to 90 more damage than originally pre-buff. So I think this definitely has a chance of being good here, but mostly just the fact that it can hit multiple units. And overall, I do think the Evo Cannon deserved a buff. It felt a little bit underwhelming. It was seeing some play in some decks, mostly cycle decks, but yeah, definitely could use a buff in my opinion. Don't be fooled, the cannon card did receive a nerf. Its shield HP goes from 892 down to 824. You can basically ignore the fact that it got an HP increase from 820 to 824. It's really not a huge difference there, but the shield HP going down almost 70 is actually pretty impactful because cannon card really relies on that first stage of health to lock onto the units that it needs to, especially on the offensive end. When you get your cannon card on the opponent's side, it's really hard to, one, get it to the tower, but once you get it to the tower, it's really hard for your opponent to get it off the tower. Once this nerf comes in with the HP, it's going to be much more difficult to actually get the cannon cart on tower, making it a pretty solid nerf in my opinion, and definitely valid with how much we are seeing it in today's meta. Following that, we have the Evo Bomber nerf that says one attack can't damage an enemy twice. So this basically means no more double bounces on either troops or towers. Now, this is a pretty significant nerf. The most important part with the Evo Bomber is the fact that you can honestly change games with it. You have a 2 elixir card, you can play at the bridge and get up to like 400 damage or even 800 if your opponent is sleeping, and that can just completely change the tides of games. But that's just not the case anymore. Those double bounces you would get now amount to 200 to maybe 400 damage, and it just really is less impactful. And this honestly hurts me a little bit because Evo Bomber is my favorite Evo. I use it all the time in so many decks, but it is just not as good anymore. It honestly goes from being a high tier Evo to middle of the pack, if not subpar. Next, the Baby Dragon will receive an increase to its splash radius from 1.2 tiles to 1.5 tiles. And overall, I think this is definitely going to be a good buff for the card because Baby Dragon has always seemed to struggle to weirdly swarm troops that it feels like it should counter, such as Bats and Goblin Gang. But I feel like this splash is definitely going to help it in that department. And specifically, Baby Dragon is seen in a lot of decks with Tornado, whether that be Lava Hound or Graveyard. So that's going to help make these splashes even easier to come by, which is definitely going to be nice. I do think that we need to look at the Ice Whiz, for example, because it got buffed from 1 splash radius to 1.5 tile splash radius back in August, and ever since that, it's seen a lot more use. So it is possible that the Baby Dragon is going to make a strong resurgence in the meta. However, I wouldn't exactly overreact to this because it's not going to help out in every scenario, but definitely going to be easier to get value with, specifically with Tornado. The Goblin Machine is getting a rework, but really it's just a buff in disguise. What's happening is the Goblin Machine is going to do a good bit more damage and hit a little bit slower. But overall, if you see there, it actually says there's a DPS increase of plus 17%, otherwise known as damage per second. And basically, this just means it's going to be doing 17% more damage than it was previously. And now this is definitely going to be a good buff for the Goblin Machine. And I feel like it could see a little bit of play, but it's just in a very bad state right now. So I really wouldn't bank on it being like a super strong card or anything. I know it is kind of like a fan favorite from what I've seen. Like a lot of people do enjoy the card now that it's not super broken and oppressive the way it was when it was first released, but I still don't think it's going to be anywhere near as strong. Even with this buff, it's not going to be great. And matter of fact, this buff is definitely warranted because the Goblin Machine is currently sitting at the lowest win rate and usage rate in Grand Challenge, which is just absolutely insane. But, this buff is going to be good for it. I'm not sure how good, though. An Evo that I really like, which is the Wall Breakers Evo, is receiving a buff with its death damage going from 195 to 292. So this is a 50% increase in the death damage. Granted, it's not to towers, but to everything else, which I think is pretty cool. And I honestly think that the Wall Breakers could come back to the meta a little bit. I feel like I see him from every now and then, not too often, but I do see him a little bit. But this damage increase is legit. Like, it basically punishes you if you don't use a spell. Like, if you use a building, it's going to die, and if you use troops, they're going to die, and then you still have the Wall Breakers spawning. So I feel like Wall Breakers, they should be sitting in a pretty good spot after this buff, and I do feel like this buff is good in general, like from a game design perspective, because it buffs the intent of the Evo Wall Breakers, which is to force out your opponent's spells. So I do like this buff a lot. The next nerf here is definitely a controversial one, and that is the Evo Goblin Barrel. Now, I've seen some different opinions on this, but basically the nerf is the decoy barrel will look different for about 1 second after deploy. I'll give my personal opinion, and I feel like the Evo Goblin Barrel is definitely broken and deserves this nerf. Some people argue that it wasn't broken upon release and that it honestly wasn't that good. I feel like that was kind of based on the meta and also the fact that Dagger Dutchess was kind of like taking over the meta at that point, but now the Evo Goblin Barrel seems seems to always get damage if your opponent cooks up a nice push. It feels like it's almost impossible to defend flawlessly unless you have the perfect cycle. And I feel like that's just honestly too strong for an evolution. And I don't feel like this nerf is going to kill the card. Like, certainly not, because basically what it's doing is it's allowing people to figure out which barrel is real and which barrel isn't, which helps you kind of prioritize which side to defend. And I feel like I find myself a lot of the times not knowing which side is the real barrel, which side is fake, which side to defend. And I feel like this is just going to help give the opposing opponent a lot of clarity and help them make better decisions on defense, because it doesn't really affect the card or the stats at all. It is only affecting the way that the decoy looks. I'm going to hit two birds with one stone right here, and we're going to cover the recruits buff and then the Evo recruits rework. So looking at it first, we see that the Evo recruits are getting a buff from 133 damage to 138. They're getting a charge distance nerf from 1.5 tiles to 2 tiles, and they're getting a charge damage increase from 273 to 276. And while these numbers might not look high or like a lot of change, honestly, but you have to remember that there's 7 recruits whenever you play that card. So even a change in 5 damage like we see here can stack up to 35 damage per hit. However, I believe the most important thing that people might kind of skimp over here is the charge distance nerf. 1.5 tiles to 2 tiles actually makes a huge difference and can honestly be like an extra second that allows you to get that last elixir to defend the recruits. Especially, I find this change is going to be very impactful in single elixir. If your opponent manages to get to the Evo recruits in single elixir, like the last 30 seconds of single, it can be pretty challenging to defend, especially depending on the deck you're playing. And a lot of times I find like I defend all the recruits, there's like 1 or 2 left, and then they just charge to my tower. Nothing I can do with that last second. No elixir. But this change is going to give you a little bit of extra time to possibly defend that. And then you have to remember, right? The only thing that changes from the recruits to the Evo recruits is that charge ability. So like the stats are the same, everything's the same. It's just the charge. So nerfing that charge is going to have a pretty big impact on the card. And I think it's going to make it much weaker for the Evo Royal recruits. However, I do preface by saying the recruits, in my opinion, standard no Evo, honestly aren't a great card. Like, I feel like they're just middle of the pack at best. So getting a 4% increase to their hit points, I don't think that's really going to change too much. It is a little bit scary seeing the recruits getting that damage buff to their normal M1 attack and then also to their charge damage. But you have to remember that the charge distance is really going to be the killer to them. So we will have to see how it plays out. But I feel like Evo recruits could be a lot worse. Next, we have the Witch getting a splash radius buff from 1 tile to 1.5 tiles, and the Witch desperately needs a buff, man. It has the second lowest win rate in Clash Royale. It's been underwhelming for some time now, and this buff is definitely a step in the right direction. It's going to be, so this 1.5 splash radius is going to be nice, since from my experience, Witch normally isn't ran in tornado decks, so it kind of relies on itself to get this good splash value. However, I do think the Witch is still going to be not a great card. I feel like it's just not enough, you know. More splash is not enough to revive this card. It's still going to be sitting at the bottom of win rates, and you know what, it's going to be a little bit better for those who use it, but for most, it's just going to be forgotten. Now, potentially for one of the bigger buffs in this whole balance change here, we see the Dagger Dutchess getting a buff to its dagger stored from 8 to 9, and then also projectile speed from 600 to 1,000. Now, if we take a look at the projectile speed first, this is pretty important because projectile speed is basically the time that the Dagger Dutchess actually shoots the missile, and then the missile connecting with the target. So the fact that this is faster is mean that opposing troops are going to get less shots on tower, less shots on your troops, and stuff like that. And dagger stored is obviously better. Like, having an extra dagger is huge. The fact that you can just reset and have 9 daggers instead of 8 is just so much more valuable here. We saw whenever it got its daggers decreased recently that it just hurt it a lot, but this increase is going to be super nice. It's going to be able to shoot its daggers and get them to the opponent's troops faster. It's going to have more daggers, and it's already been making a comeback a little bit. It's good against bait, so it's been seeing some more use, and I think that's just going to be a continued uphill progression for the Dagger Dutchess, so definitely be prepared to face more of it. The Fisherman is receiving a nerf to its slowdown duration from 2.5 seconds to 1.5, and this is definitely deserved. As much as I love Fisherman, it's probably one of my top 5 cards in terms of just overall utility and ability, but it definitely deserves a nerf. I mean, it's been strong. The nerf kind of felt inevitable for Fisherman, and I was kind of brainstorming, and I honestly thought it could use a range nerf, whether that be like half a tile, something like that. It feels like it has a lot of range, but I feel like a slowdown duration nerf is honestly fine as well. I was looking at it today when I was using the Fisherman, and it just felt pretty strong, like the way it just slows down troops for so long. So I can definitely back this nerf. I think that's pretty good overall. And the repercussions of this nerf, it means that Fisherman's still going to be the same against tanks for the most part. Like, you really don't care how fast those move. But the big change is going to be against the heavy hitters. Whenever the Fisherman is pulling a Pekka, a mini Pekka, really just like a tank killer in general, it's something that can one-shot the Fisherman. It's going to be more important to protect it because the Fisherman can't protect itself as well anymore with this slowdown. So obviously in the meta right now, we see Fisherman and guards. That's going to continue to be a super strong combo, I feel like. But in general, naked Fishermans are not going to be as good just because it's harder to protect the Fisherman itself. One of my favorite Evos this past season has been the Evo Ice Spirit, and that's receiving a rework here. We see that the Ice Blast count is going from 3 to 2, and the Ice Blast damage is going from 110 to 163. Basically, what this means is that the damage is going to be the same, so you're not losing out on anything there, but the Ice Blast count going from 3 to 2 is pretty huge. I mean, 3 freezes has always been kind of insane. The fact that you can use that on a tank and just kind of shut it down for like 10 seconds is kind of wild, but now it's going down to 2. That's definitely going to be huge. It's going to be noticeable. It's going to be all those things. And I think, you know what, double freeze is still strong. Like, don't hear what I'm not saying here. Double freeze is great, but triple freeze was just like insane. Like, and this insanity was what was forcing Evo Ice Spirit into decks that it normally didn't really belong into. Like, we saw it in Royal Giant, Bridge Spam. It's even in some bait decks. It kind of getting forced into decks right now. But I feel like once this nerf comes out, it's really only going to be seen in cycle decks and decks that you'd already use Ice Spirit in. I don't feel like it's going to be forced into these other archetypes that we've seen as of currently. The beloved Dark Prince is receiving a buff to its charge distance, going from 3.5 tiles, making that down to 3 tiles here. And you know what? This one just kind of feels right. Like, the Dark Prince charge has always felt long to me. It always feels like it's taken forever to charge up. And to put this into perspective, the Prince actually takes 2 tiles to charge. So the Dark Prince currently takes a more 1.5 tiles than the Prince does to charge, which is kind of wild. But this buff is definitely going to make Dark Prince better. It's not going to be insane, I don't think, but it's definitely going to be better than it is currently, obviously, right, because it's a buff. But just to put this into perspective of how much of a difference charge distance can make, we need to look back at the Prince and the Rare Matter receiving a buff back in, I want to say, like August, around that time. Basically, the Prince went from 3 tiles, and actually the Rare Matter too, they both went from 3 tiles to 1.5 tiles, and this was around the time Goblin Machine came out, and man, it was all you would see is Prince, Rare Matter, Goblin Machine rage. It was a crazy time. It felt like they charged so fast, and that's honestly what charge distance can do. But basically, the repercussions of that was Rare Matter and Prince eventually went back to 2 tiles, which they are both at today. So the Dark Prince being at 3 tiles is not quite as quick of a charge as those two, but it still just proves that charge distance is important and can make a big impact on how good a card is. The Mighty Miner is receiving a buff to its damage increase time, going from 2.25 seconds to 2 seconds. Basically, this just means the Mighty Miner is going to charge up and do more damage quicker. And I feel like this is going to be a hard one to predict until I see it in action. So I do kind of like hold my thoughts on this one until I actually see the gameplay. But based off what I'm seeing here on paper, this looks a little bit underwhelming in terms of a buff. I feel like it's not going to be crazy. I don't even think it's going to be... I think it's going to be good. I don't think it's going to be great by any stretch of the imagination, but I feel like the main problem with Mighty Miner right now is the fact that it's just not very viable in many decks. Like, it's just not a good enough card to squeeze into many decks. I mean, obviously, the deck that it's most known for is Mighty Miner LogBait, that quick cycle deck, but that deck just gets ruined by Royal Hog's Earthquake, which we've seen a good bit in the meta, in the Royal Tournament, and all that great stuff. So it's definitely not going to be great. I don't feel like even with this buff, it's going to be better, but I don't think it's going to be anything special. I think it's just kind of going to feel the same, and that's honestly where I think the Mighty Miner is going to stay for now. The nerf everybody's been waiting for is here, and that's the nerf to the Goblenstien. The Doctor's HP is going from 885 down to 721, minus 19% in hit points. Now, this is a significant nerf. Don't get it wrong here, but I feel like they could have done some more to the card. But, this is fine for now. Kind of feel it. If it's still strong, nerf it again. But, yeah, so obviously this is affecting the Doctor's health, right? And the Doctor's an important part of the Goblenstien, because if the Doctor's dead, you can't pop the ability, and without the ability, the Goblenstien is pretty underwhelming. So we need to look at this in the sense of the HP. This does not die to Fireball. It does still die to Fireball log. I've seen a lot of people saying it dies to Fireball. That's not true. 721 out heals Fireball, so it's still going to be surviving to Fireball, so make sure you're aware of that. However, this does make it obviously weaker, so like the Pekka can actually now one-shot the Goblenstien Doctor, which is kind of crazy. The fact that a Goblenstien Doctor could survive a Pekka shot, like what even is that, right? But all right, so it does die to that now. So obviously the Goblenstien Doctor is going to be easier to take out. It's already pretty hard to take out just because of how much HP it has, along with the stun, along with the ability. It just felt like it always survived, but now it's going to be a lot more easier to manage. I'm not sure it's enough to make it a like not good card. I feel like it's probably still going to be the best champion easily, but I think it's definitely going to be more manageable, and it's going to feel a lot nicer compared to the Goblenstien we're facing right now. The next buff here is actually pretty interesting. So we see the Electro Giant get an increase to its sight clip from 0 to 2 tiles. And I'm not going to lie, guys, I actually had to do some research on what sight clip was. I was not familiar with the term, but all you need to know is basically like 99% of the time, this is equivalent to a sight range nerf by two tiles. So what this means is now you can't play your buildings all the way in the opposite lane and pull the Electro Giant some crazy far distance. Now it's like a normal tank tower targeting troop, so you can play it in the opposite lane 4x3 tiles. Like think of it like pulling a Goblin Giant. Now you can play it a little bit in the opposite lane, but nothing crazy like you could before. And one thing that this is going to help the Electro Giant out with a lot, other than the obvious of not being able to travel as far to towers, is the fact that it's going to clump up buildings and troops more, which means a Lightning's going to get a lot of value. Obviously, Lightning and E-Giant are like two peas in a pod. They always come together, so that's going to be good there for some E-Giant synergy. However, I do think people might overreact to this buff because the E-Giant itself is still underwhelming. It's not near as good as it once was. I think it's going to be better, not great at all, but definitely a good sign for E-Giant players, so we love to see that. Now we see the Mini Pekka's getting a buff with its damage going from 720 to 754. And I'm going to be honest, I like this buff for the Mini Pekka. Mini Pekka's already been one of the scariest cards to see in a push coming down, just because of the sheer amount of damage this can put in with 1, 2, even 3 shots. It is crazy. So this 30 damage increase is going to be absolutely crazy if you let the Mini Pekka lock on. I do think the Mini Pekka does still suffer from the problem of not being very tanky, not having a lot of health, being able to die easily, but this is definitely good in the decks Mini Pekka is already good in. I don't think we're going to see it in new decks, but like I said, like the old decks that Mini Pekka is already running, Goblin Giant, Sparky, and maybe Giant specifically, it's going to be good. Like I can already see a Goblin Giant and a Mini Pekka coming charging at my tower, Mini Pekka killing my tower in 2 shots, it's going to feel like, and it's just going to be game over from there. But yeah, Mini Pekka is definitely going to continue to be one of the scariest cards in my opinion, but I don't think it's going to be crazy good. Don't force it into your homemade decks. It's just Mini Pekka, all right? It's nothing crazy. It's just the Mini Pekka. Last but not least, we see the change to the Lumberjack. It's classified as a rework, but I'm going to call it a buff, a slight buff that is. So we see the rage duration go from 6 to 5.5 seconds, and then the damage go from 242 to 255. Now, neither of these are super huge changes, but I will say, like, when's the last time you played a Lumberjack and you used all 6 seconds of the rage? I feel like I may have never even achieved that. So I feel like it getting tuned down to 5.5 seconds isn't going to make much difference at all. Now, we can take a look at the Lumberjack's damage getting an increase, and I think, you know what, it's definitely going to be nice. I'm not sure how noticeable it will be. I actually did some research and I looked, and it actually does still 2-tap guard shield. Guard shields are sitting at 256 damage and the Lumberjack does 255, so it's going to take 3 shots to kill 1 guard total. And then also looks like it's still going to take 3 hits to kill most support units, because the Mother Witch, the Magic Archer, and the Zappies are still going to take 3 hits from the Lumberjack, so it's not going to be tearing up through your support units performance, anything like that. I mean, it's going to be better. Not sure how noticeable. The most noticeable it would be using it as a tank killer, taking down the bigger troops, obviously. I mean, even though it's not too much damage, you do have to remember the Lumberjack has a high hit speed, so it's still a fairly good change overall, in my opinion. I like it. You know, Lumberjack could use some love, so I do like that. But that's the last change of the video, guys, and that's all. Remember, this is work in progress balance changes, so make sure to give your input. Let me know if you guys want to see a change or if you don't like a change that is currently listed, and what your thoughts on like how the cards are going to be after these changes, because I'm interested to know. You know, we're still learning. We haven't seen the cards in action yet, so that's going to be definitely cool to look at. But that's all for this one, guys. This is a new style of video. Let me know if you guys enjoyed this style of video, you know, because I really enjoyed making this one, kind of just predicting what these cards are going to be like and looking at the balances. But yeah, that's all for this one, guys. Thank you so much for tuning in. Make sure to subscribe if you guys enjoyed, and I'll catch you guys in the next video. Peace out.